Amara woke up the next morning with a heavy heart. The previous night's strange encounter with Adrian left her feeling unsettled, and she couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that something had shifted between them. But she had no time to dwell on it. The demands of the mansion awaited, and she was determined to prove that she could handle whatever Adrian threw at her. She hurried through her morning tasks, the echo of Adrian's harsh words from their previous encounters still fresh in her mind. Despite his fleeting moment of what almost seemed like kindness, she knew better than to expect any genuine warmth from him. He was a man who thrived on power and control, and she was just another cog in the machine that was his life. As the day progressed, Amara found herself under an even more intense scrutiny than before. Adrian seemed to be everywhere, his icy gaze following her as she moved through the mansion. It was as though he was looking for any excuse to criticize her, to reassert the dominance that she had briefly seen slip the night before. By midday, the tension was unbearable. Amara was in the middle of polishing the silverware in the grand dining room when she felt a shadow fall over her. She looked up to see Adrian standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and his expression as cold as ever. "You're slower than the last housekeeper," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Is this the best you can do?" Amara bit her lip, forcing herself to stay calm. "I'm doing my best, sir," she replied, keeping her voice even. She refused to rise to his bait. "Your best isn't good enough," he snapped, stepping closer. "I expect perfection. If you can't deliver that, you're useless to me." The harshness of his words stung, but Amara refused to let him see how much they affected her. "I'll work faster," she said quietly, focusing on the task at hand. Adrian watched her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "See that you do," he said coldly. "I won't tolerate mediocrity." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he paused and looked back at her. "And one more thing," he added, his voice low and menacing. "You're here to work, not to play games. I don't know what you think you're doing, but whatever it is, it stops now." Amara looked up, confusion flickering across her face. "I don't understand, sir." "Don't play innocent with me," Adrian snapped, his eyes flashing with anger. "You think I don't see what you're trying to do? You're not the first woman who's tried to worm her way into my life." The accusation hit her like a punch to the gut. "Sir, I assure you, I'm only here to do my job," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. Adrian's expression hardened. "You can drop the act, Miss Davis. I know your type. Women like you see a man with power and money, and you think you can manipulate your way into his favor. But let me make one thing perfectly clear. You mean nothing to me. You're a servant in my house, and that's all you'll ever be." Amara's heart sank as the full weight of his words hit her. He thought she was trying to seduce him, to take advantage of him like the countless women who had come before her. It was humiliating, infuriating, and deeply hurtful all at once. But more than anything, it was unjust. "That's not true," she said, her voice firmer now. "I have no interest in your money or your power, Mr. Blackwood. I'm here to pay off my family's debt. Nothing more." "Then act like it," Adrian hissed, stepping even closer, so close she could feel the heat of his anger radiating off him. "Do your job, keep your head down, and stay out of my way. If I so much as suspect that you're trying to pull any tricks, you'll be out of here so fast your head will spin. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," Amara whispered, her throat tight with emotion. Good. He spat before turning on his heel and leaving the room, the door slamming shut behind him. As soon as he was gone, Amara let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. She had never felt so small, so utterly powerless. The way he had spoken to her, the accusations he had thrown at her, it was as if he had torn her down to nothing with just a few cruel words. She wanted to scream, to cry, to fight back against the unfairness of it all, but she knew that would only make things worse. Adrian Blackwood was a man who thrived on control, and she had just learned the hard way what happened when someone threatened that control, even unintentionally. For the rest of the day, Amara moved through her tasks like a ghost, her mind swirling with a mixture of anger, hurt, and determination. She had thought she could handle Adrian's harshness, but this was different. This was personal. He had attacked her character, accused her of things she would never even dream of doing, and all because he couldn't stand the idea of someone getting too close. As the evening approached, Amara was assigned to prepare Adrian's study for his nightly work. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight against the encroaching darkness outside. She moved quietly, arranging the papers on his desk, making sure everything was in its proper place. But as she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see Adrian standing in the doorway, his cold eyes fixed on her. But the room was empty. She turned back to the desk, her hands stilling as she noticed a folder that had been left open, its contents partially visible. Curiosity got the better of her, and she hesitated for a moment before gently lifting the cover. What she saw made her blood run cold. Inside the folder were documents, bank statements, legal papers, and what looked like contracts. But it was the name on the topmost sheet that caught her attention. Davis. Her family name. Amara's heart raced as she scanned the documents, her eyes widening as she realized what they were. These were records of the debt her family owed, but there was something else. Correspondence between her father and a lawyer. Negotiations that had taken place without her knowledge. And then there was a letter signed by Adrian Blackwood himself, detailing the terms of the agreement that had brought her here. She felt sick. Her family's debt had been sold to Adrian. He owned her family's future, and by extension, he owned her. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She was nothing more than a pawn in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. Suddenly, the door to the study creaked open, and Amara jumped, quickly closing the folder and placing it back on the desk. She turned to see Adrian standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Amara's mind raced, trying to come up with an excuse, but she knew it was useless. She had been caught. "I was just arranging your desk, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Adrian's eyes narrowed as he stepped into the room, his gaze flicking to the folder she had hastily closed. "You were snooping," he accused, his voice hardening. "No, Don't lie to me," he snapped, his sudden outburst making her flinch. "You think you can come into my house, dig through my things, and get away with it?" Amara shook her head, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "I wasn't snooping, I swear. I saw my name and I didn't know." "You didn't know what?" Adrian demanded, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That I own your family? That I hold your entire future in my hands?" His words cut through her like a knife. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Why would I?" Adrian replied coldly. You're nothing but a means to an end, Miss Davis. Your family's debt is just another asset in my portfolio. Whether you know the details or not is irrelevant. Amara's heart shattered at his words. She had known he was ruthless, but hearing him admit so callously that she was nothing more than a tool to him, it was too much. You don't have to be so cruel, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's eyes flashed with something she couldn't quite place. Anger, maybe, or was it guilt? But whatever it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold, hard exterior she had come to know. Cruel, he repeated, his tone mocking. You think this is cruel? This is business, Miss Davis. And in business, there's no room for sentimentality. You should be grateful I'm allowing you to work off your family's debt at all. I could have just as easily thrown you all out on the street. Amara felt the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I understand, she said, her voice hollow. I'll finish my work and stay out of your way. Adrian stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving Amara standing there, her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. As the door clicked shut behind him, Amara sank to the floor, her body trembling with the force of the emotions she had been holding back. She had never felt so alone, so utterly defeated. But as she sat there in the darkness, a new resolve began to form within her. She might be powerless against Adrian Blackwood, but she wasn't going to let him break her. Not yet. Not ever. But little did she know, Adrian stood just outside the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob once more, torn between the desire to walk away and the strange, unwelcome urge to go back in and apologize. Amara barely slept that night. Her mind kept replaying the cruel words Adrian had thrown at her. His arrogance, his cold indifference, it all stung so deeply. It wasn't just that he treated her like she was nothing more than a tool to be used. It was the sheer power he wielded over her life, over her family's future. Every time she thought about the documents she had seen, about the weight of her family's debt resting in his hands, her stomach churned. Morning came too quickly. Despite the exhaustion clinging to her bones, she forced herself out of bed and into the kitchen, ready to start her duties for the day. She couldn't afford to falter now. If she gave him even the slightest reason, Adrian would throw her out, and then her family would be left with nothing. As she moved about the kitchen, preparing breakfast, the house was eerily quiet. She hadn't seen Adrian since their encounter in the study. Maybe it was better that way. The longer she stayed out of his way, the safer she would be. But as the day wore on, it became increasingly clear that staying out of his way wasn't going to be an option. Amara was scrubbing the floors in the grand hallway when she heard his footsteps approaching. She didn't dare look up, but she could feel the weight of his presence as he stopped beside her, looming over her like a storm cloud ready to break. Miss Davis, Adrian said, his voice cold and controlled. She froze for a moment, then slowly sat back on her heels and turned to face him. Yes, sir? Adrian's expression was unreadable, his piercing blue eyes fixed on hers. There was something different about him today, though she couldn't quite place it. He seemed tense, as if something was gnawing at him beneath that icy exterior. I've given you tasks, he said slowly, and you've completed them adequately. But I'm starting to wonder, if you really understand your place in this house. Amara clenched her jaw, her pulse quickening. I do, sir. Do you? His voice was soft, almost mocking. Because from where I stand, it seems like you're forgetting who holds all the cards here. Her hands clenched into fists, though she kept them hidden behind her back. I haven't forgotten. Adrian stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from him, but there was nothing comforting about it. He was like fire, dangerous, capable of burning her if she got too close. Good, he said, his voice dangerously low. Because I don't need reminders of where you come from or what you think you deserve. You're here to work, to pay off your family's debt. And the sooner you remember that, the easier things will be for you. Amara's eyes flashed with defiance, but she forced herself to stay silent. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fight back, even though every fiber of her being wanted to lash out. The truth was, she had no power here. He had made that perfectly clear. Adrian seemed to sense her anger, and it only seemed to fuel him. You think I'm being cruel, don't you? He asked, his tone soft but dangerous. You think I'm some heartless monster, don't you? Amara didn't answer. She couldn't. Answer me, he demanded, his voice sharp. I think you're not who you seem to be, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's eyes darkened, and for a moment, she thought she had crossed a line. His jaw clenched, and he stepped even closer, invading her personal space. You don't know me, he said, his voice tight with restrained anger. And I suggest you stop trying to. The words stung, but there was something in the way he said them, something in his expression that made her pause. For a split second, she saw something behind the coldness in his eyes, something raw, something painful. But then it was gone, and Adrian turned on his heel, walking away without another word, leaving Amara to wonder what had just happened. The day continued in a blur of tension. Adrian's words echoed in her mind as she moved from one task to another, her thoughts swirling with confusion. There was something more to him than the cold, arrogant facade he showed the world, but every time she thought she might be getting close to understanding it, he shut her out again. Later that evening, as she was cleaning one of the smaller sitting rooms, Joseph, the butler, appeared at the doorway. Miss Davis, he said, his voice as formal as ever. Mr. Blackwood would like to see you in his office. Amara's heart sank. Had she done something wrong? Was he going to fire her after all? She wiped her hands on her apron and nodded, following Joseph through the winding hallways of the mansion. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. When they reached Adrian's office, Joseph knocked once before opening the door and motioning for her to enter. Adrian was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, papers spread out in front of him, but his attention was focused entirely on her as she stepped inside. Close the door, Joseph, Adrian said without looking up. The butler nodded and left the room, leaving Amara alone with him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Adrian's gaze was intense, his eyes flicking over her as if he were assessing her, trying to figure out what to do with her. Sit, he finally said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. Amara hesitated for a moment before taking the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. I've been thinking, Adrian began, leaning back in his chair, about art arrangement. Amara's stomach twisted. This couldn't be good. I've decided, he continued, his voice cool and detached, that I've been far too lenient with you. Lenient? Amara echoed, disbelief lacing her voice. Was this some kind of twisted joke? He had been nothing but harsh since she arrived. Adrian's eyes darkened, and his lips curved into a cold smile. Yes. You've been sloppy, disobedient, and far too comfortable here. I've allowed you too much freedom, and that ends now. Amara's heart raced. Sir, I've done everything you've asked. Have you? Adrian cut her off, his voice sharp. Because from where I stand, it seems like you've forgotten your place. I haven't, she insisted, her voice shaking slightly. I've done my job. You're here to work, not to make me second-guess your loyalty, Adrian interrupted again. His voice dropped to a dangerous low. You think I didn't notice you snooping through my documents? Amara froze. That was an accident, sir. I didn't mean to. I don't care about your excuses, he snapped, his eyes flashing with anger. You crossed a line, and now you're going to pay for it. Her blood ran cold at his words. She had never seen him this angry before. There was a menace in his tone that sent a chill down her spine. Adrian stood and walked around the desk, towering over her as he leaned down, his face inches from hers. I'm going to make this very clear, he said, his voice low and threatening. You are nothing more than a servant in this house. You are here because I allow it. Do you understand? Amara nodded, her throat tight with fear. You're going to work harder, faster, and without question, Adrian continued, his eyes boring into hers. I'll make sure you remember your place, even if I have to remind you every single day. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. She refused to let him see how much he was affecting her. Adrian straightened, his gaze never leaving her. Get out of my office, he ordered coldly. And don't forget, you belong to me now. Amara stood, her legs trembling beneath her, and quickly left the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never felt so small, so utterly powerless. The weight of his words pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket, and for the first time, she truly understood what it meant to be at Adrian Blackwood's mercy. That night, Amara lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing. Adrian's cruelty had reached a new level. He had made it clear that she was nothing more than a pawn in his game, a tool to be used and discarded at his whim. But beneath his harsh words and cold demeanor, there was something else, a flicker of something deeper, something he was trying desperately to hide. She couldn't stop thinking about the way his eyes had darkened when he accused her of snooping. There was more to his anger than just her intrusion. It was as if he was afraid of something, afraid that she might uncover a secret he didn't want anyone to know. Amara's heart ached with the realization that she was trapped in a situation she couldn't escape from. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she tried to prove herself, Adrian would never see her as anything more than a servant. As Amara lay in bed, her thoughts raced. The suffocating weight of Adrian's words crushed her spirit, but she resolved not to let him see her break. She would endure this. No matter how harsh Adrian became, no matter what he did, she would pay off her family's debt and walk away with her dignity intact. But just as her mind began to settle, a sound caught her attention, faint but unmistakable, the creak of a floorboard outside her door. Her breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. She strained to hear, listening for any further movement. The mansion was quiet, eerily so, but the sense of someone's presence lingered. Someone was standing outside her room. Amara's mind whirled. Was it Adrian? Was he watching her? Why? She sat up in bed, her body tense with unease, and for a fleeting moment, she thought about going to the door to check. But something stopped her. Fear. Or maybe, deep down, the realization that things were far more complicated than they seemed. As the seconds ticked by in suffocating silence, Amara heard the sound of footsteps retreating down the hall, slow, deliberate, and unnerving. What had Adrian been doing outside her door in the dead of night?